All right, fam. Thank y'all so much. I'm grateful to be here. Today I wanted to just go through some more on Express. So last time we linked up, we started talking about server side stuff and built out a small little Express application, which I'll pull up in a second. If you don't recall, Express is a package in JavaScript that allows for us to create very easily servers using JavaScript. The server, essentially, the main function of the server is to listen for client requests and respond with some data, right? So just give me a quick thumbs up if you remember what I'm talking about, right? We started getting into this a little bit last time. The whole idea was, hey, when I want to create a server, there's a couple key parts to the aspect of launching a server, and we worked on the majority of those things together. So I'm going to actually pull up that server side code base that we worked on in VS Code and give us a rundown of what that looks like before I ask us to go through some of this again. So just switching screens here. Sorry, my VS Code is loading for a quick second. Cool. Awesome. So what we see here is a new project that I started last time we linked up. The project itself is in a folder I called server side. And in that server side folder, we did a lot of different things together. The first thing was we created a new package.json file to essentially tell this project folder, hey, we're going to be working on a node-based project, right? Any project that you want to leverage node packages in, you need to have a package.json file inside of that folder. The package.json file is responsible for some of the metadata of your project, but it also holds a list of your dependencies, which is why it's important to have it. To create a package.json file, we just use the npm command line tool, and I'll go over those commands in a second. But basically, we use that tool to create this package.json file, which allowed for us to then install Express. Again, I'll go over that step as well. But after installing Express, it gave us the opportunity to then launch and create our own server. The server that you see here is a very simple one, and creating servers with Express is also fairly simple. Once you've installed Express, it will be put into your node modules folder, which then allows for you to import it into your code base. Importing code on the server side is a little different than importing code in the client side. You can see that by way of the statement for importing. When you're working on the server side, your import export logic happens through a JavaScript for a function and keyword called require. Require basically allows for you to grab modules from your node modules and load them into your particular application. Again, just want to double tap on the fact that the import export in a React-based setting is a little different. You do import from, whereas on the server side, you're going to see a lot of this const require syntax. Once you've required in this module, and that's kind of how people talk about it, say, hey, require in Express or require Express in your app. The fun starts because Express as a library. So on the right-hand side, what we see here is we're requiring this module called Express. Express, when you require something in, it turns whatever you're bringing in into a module that you can then use within your project, which is why we saved it to a variable here with the same name. So now whenever I refer to Express in my code, I'm actually referring to whatever the module was that the Express package contained. So what's cool about the Express module and the functions and everything it contains is that it does all of the big pieces you need to launch your server very simply. Remember, your server needs to do two things. It needs to listen for client requests, and it needs to respond with data to those client requests. After we created like a holder for the modules for the Express package, we are then able to use the functions that are built into it. And one of the functions is just a simple function that we can call that allows for us to create a new application for our server. The application is important because that's what has all of the built-in functions and things that we need in order to run our server. That application requires us to then define a port that we want the server to run on. Remember, the port is essentially a extension of your machine that says, hey, your server is going to be running on that particular extension of that machine's IP address. So you can define the port. There are common ports that are used by other applications on your computer. So it's just kind of a good practice to choose one that's a little further up. Something like 3000 is fairly uncommonly used, though you will see a lot of web dev tutorials using port 3000 for things like an Express server or a React app, etc. So 3000, sometimes do 9000, 8000, things that are a little bit higher up there, and atypical. You can always add some numbers to it, etc., to just ensure that you're using a port that's not used. Of course, there's commands that we can leverage to just see what ports are actively used. But just for your sake, just try to choose a port that is commonly not used. And when I say commonly not used, I just mean by the running applications on your computer. So if you already know, hey, I have an app that uses port 3000 and it's always on my machine, then you might not be able to use that. But most of us don't. And so using something like 3000 is okay. The whole point of this is that the port becomes an extension of the IP address or your local host if you're running your server locally. Basically, you will navigate to that particular URL with that IP address or the host name for like localhost, etc., and that particular port to go and see and interact with your server routes. Server routes are essentially little functions that leverage the application that you created in Express to define the route that a client might send a request to. If you have a client can only send a request to routes that exist on a server. If I sent a request to a route that doesn't exist on a server, I'll get back an error that says something like, hey, this cannot get that route or something of that nature, right? Cannot find that route, etc. There'll be an error thrown. Routes need to define a couple things for them, for the client. The first thing that a route defines for the client is what type of HTTP request is used in order to create the route, in order for the client to request that route, right? So there's a couple different types of HTTP methods that we can use. We reviewed those last time we linked up. The most common ones are GET and POST requests. Of course, there's other ones, put, patch, delete. But the two that you want to be most familiar with are GET requests and POST requests. And we'll talk a little bit more about POST requests a little later today. A GET request, though, is by far the simplest type of request because a GET request basically is saying, hey, I'm creating a route that the client might call. When the client calls this route, they're going to tell me the path. And so long as they're coming to this particular path that I've defined, then we can send them back some data, right? Typically, GET requests, the reason that they're considered more simple requests is because you're not really looking for the client to send you any data in the process of sending that request. A GET request is typically just, hey, I want to get some data. And the server's like, I bet, let me give you this data. Sometimes when you want to do a little bit more, let's say, sophisticated checks, right? So you might say something like, hey, I want to get this data. And your server's like, all right, I see that you want to get this data, but I want to know who you are, what's up with you, like, you know what I'm saying? Can I even give you this data, right? Send me some information that proves that I can get, you can get this data from me. In that case, then you're going to be passing some information from the client to the server. And of course, you can do that with a GET request. That's true. But more commonly, when we're sending data to a server, we'll use what we call a post request, which allows for us to essentially pass some data into the body of the request or in through some other means that will allow for us to then communicate that data over on the server side. What we see here, though, is a very simple kind of GET request that says, hey, when someone evokes the server at our route, we're just going to send them this simple string of data. The res.send is coming off of a function that all routes need to define. Every route will have to have a function that is structured like this. The function will have two parameters inside of it, one to represent your request object and one to represent your response object. You can rename these to be like request or response if you'd like. But typically you'll see people just kind of leave them on their shorthand. The point is that these two parameters are automatically passed in by Express when you call a function in a route. So whatever you call them, just know that parameter 1 is going to be the request, parameter 2 will be the response. The purpose of the request object, and we'll look a little bit more at the API today to just see some of the documentation. The request object kind of references the object being sent by the client. So when a client sends us a request, all the information from that request will be stored in this request object that then we can use within this function. Similarly, whenever we're getting ready to send a response, Express creates a response object. The response object has some helpful functions that allow for us to send data back to the client. You can see an example of that here, where we sent this data down. And if you look at the doc that is kind of connected to it on VS Code, like if I hover over this, you can see a few more examples of the type of data that you can send via the response object, right? So you can send data, you can send a JSON file, you can send some HTML, but also you can also include, as you see like here, they're chaining some methods. So the response object also allows for you to define a status code that you can then send with your data. So if you want to tell the client, hey, we successfully got your request and here's the data, you can send a status with a 200 level status. A status of the 400 level is typically showing client error. So like, hey, the client, something in your request isn't proper. 300 level response statuses are typically for redirects. If you're going to send the client to a different place, you send back a redirect. And then 500 level status codes are typically if the server encountered any errors, like executing a code or a function or something like that. Point is, the response object, and like I said, we'll take a look at that API documentation today, also has a set of helpful methods. Send is one of them, but status is another one of them that we use in order to basically send the data back when the client makes the request. Lastly, in order to get your server to run, right, to be able to take traffic at a particular in a particular way, we have to use the app.listen function, which basically tells the server, hey, start listening for traffic on our particular port. When this function starts to run, you get a callback function that you can call. And this callback function basically executes whatever's inside of this function body when the server is finally listening. So it's common that you'll see people put a little console log message in there, because the console log message will let you know, hey, our server is up and running. And that's basically how we wrote the code for starting the server. With that code established, if I want to run this server, particularly to see it in action, right, all I got to do is in my terminal for that particular project where all my files are being housed, etc., right, I want to use node to start the server. To do that, I can run the command node with the file that contains the JavaScript code for the server. So in my case, I called it index.js. In some other cases, you might call it something else. Some tutorials call it app.js. Some tutorials call it server.js, whatever, backend.js, whatever you call it. Then you use Node to call that particular file. So in my case, I'll do the node index.js. As you can see, that console log message for our application will start, and I will be able to see this particular server running on port 3000. So if I go back to a browser and, if I go back to a browser and go to localhost 3000, I would expect for my my server data to come back, because this is an interesting point. Whenever you're going to a particular URL in the browser, right? This is a point that's worth keeping in mind and even taking a note of for yourself. Whenever you go to a URL browser in the URL, right? You're going to be performing one type of request. Based on this server, I'm sure you can guess what type of request that is. It's a GET request, right? Anytime you go to a particular domain on your browser, you're performing a GET request, right? This means that what method you're calling on the server is a GET request method, like we just saw here. Let me just pull this back down. Right? So we only have one route kind of working right now, which is this GET request route. It says, hey, get this particular, whenever we see this route, like our root route, which looks like this, right? We're going to send this piece of data. Well, all we did was go to the URL in the browser, right? So what's happening under the scenes, or behind the scenes, I was gonna say under the hood, behind the scenes, is our browser is performing that GET request for us and getting the data, and then reloading the screen with that data as HTML, interestingly enough, right? So if I inspect this element and open up the JavaScript debugger and go to the network tab, I can see all of the activity of a particular networking session on a website if I open this network inspector and refresh the page. As you can see, there's a couple different requests that are being made here. The most important of which is this localhost one that that goes ahead and creates that request to our API, which is our server, right? The server, you can tell that this is coming from here because on these tabs, you'll be able to check out the request headers, right? So the headers are essentially the information that live inside of that request object that I was just showing you. In this request, we can see things like, where was the request URL to? What was the method, right? What was the status code, right? So essentially what seems like happened was our server got this request and it sent back our response with this bit of data and a status of 304, which is interesting. One of the things that would be cool to see is if I were to go back to here and let's say I want to try to change the status. So let's say here I'm going to say res.status 200.send. I think I got to put the status as, oh yeah, it's not a string. Res.status 200.send. Hello world, we're live on our first server. So I'm just going to change up that route a little bit. And also I'm going to move this route up that I was working on earlier just for the sake of having another one there to just play with. Don't worry about it for right now, but we're going to just focus on this GET request. So I'm going to save this. But anytime I make a change to the server, I got to stop the current server from running, right? And you can see our server is still running here. I can't execute commands in this state because the server is still running. To kill the server, I got to do Control-C to stop the process for that server. And then in order to restart the server, I got to just use node index.js again after saving my changes. So doing that, we can see the server's running again. If I go back here and I refresh this particular page, you can see let's see. So our server still responded, but we didn't get a change in the status, which is interesting. We're still getting this 304 particularly, which is interesting. This backend bundle thing is for the Chrome extension. I'm not even really sure which extension is pulling that up, so don't worry too much about that. But this one is interesting because we want to see this localhost drawn change a bit, but we're still getting that 304 status, which in some cases might mean that this isn't sending the status, but it also could just be something kind of up with our browser, which is why it's helpful to have other pieces of code that or other applications that allow for us to test these routes out and get some real-time insight as to how these routes are performing. And to do that, that's one of the reasons why you'd want to use an app like Postman on your machine. Postman is essentially an application that will make it easy for you to test your routes on a particularly active server, and just ensure, like, things like the statuses are updated or things like the headers are proper, etc. Right? What's cool about Postman is you can use it for both external URLs and APIs as well as internal ones or local ones, like things like this local server that we've created. So just to give y'all a couple quick examples after all of these pop-ups pop up. I use Postman a bit all the time in a lot of different apps that I'm working on. So you can see it here on these tabs are a lot of different routes that I was testing. The way Postman works is you go ahead, click the plus button, and then you can test a URL for a route that you want to see. So that route could be an external URL. It also could be something like localhost 3000, right? So if I perform a GET request to localhost 3000, that is going to perform a request to this express route that we defined because the server is still running right now on localhost 3000. So with that server running, I should be able to, in Postman, perform this request just by pressing send up here. And as you can see, I am able to make the request. I get the body back, which is the same body that we saw in the browser. But as you can see, that 200 level request status is coming up. So for whatever reason on the browser, it's not showing up the right way. It could be caching or something wrong on just like how the browser's looking at it. But again, that's why I would test these routes on Postman to just ensure things are coming back as I intend for them to. So let's take a quick pause for a sec, just so that y'all can try this on your own, right? So I know that we started working on this server API ourselves last time. So go ahead and launch your own server. If you don't have one, I'll show you some instructions in a second to do this. If you do have one, go ahead, try to launch your server and run a route on Postman. As I was just getting to last time, I built a secondary route called test. So this will allow me to, this says, hey, if I ever go to this particular path, I'll get a different response. So on Postman, what I'm going to do now is just kind of put that path in there and just send to ensure that also that, okay, cool, I'm also getting this other route is working as well. So go ahead, try to test your routes on Postman with your own Express server up. For those of y'all who have it, go ahead and raise your hand when you're done, just so I know, hey, you're rocking with me. And for those of y'all who don't, let's talk a little bit about what you have to do if you were going to try to launch this Express server again. I told you I'd go through that code a little bit more. The getting started section on the Express website is very, very helpful because it breaks down a lot of the code that you need in order to get started very simply. Realistically, all you need to do to get Express going is to install it to a particular project folder. But it's really important to kind of understand how those projects are going to be structured. So the getting started installation section on Express actually does a great job of putting together the steps that you need. This guide is assuming that you understand how to use the terminal, and it's going to introduce you to a couple terminal-based commands to start an application. So in the terminal, if you ever run the command mkdir in the terminal, this will create a folder for you. So what this first line is doing, and you can ignore the dollar sign. The dollar sign is just what allows you to know, hey, you're supposed to execute this command in the terminal. So in the terminal, if you typed in mkdir my app, right, and then cd my app, what you're doing is essentially creating a folder called my app in your terminal, changing into that directory, and then it's going through the steps that we did together in class, which was, hey, initialize the package.json for that inside of that particular folder, right? The cd command so first you made the folder, cd changes you into the folder, then it's saying, hey, run npm init, which allows for, it has a little interface which asks you to create questions for how to create your package.json. You can press enter to use the default values, or you can change some of the values and then press enter as well. The entry point piece, right, is where you get to define what is the file name, right? So if you want to create a new file, if you want your file name to not be index.js, and you're saying, hey, my main file in my JavaScript will be app.js or server.js, right? This is where you can change this. Here in this tutorial, you see them saying, hey, change it to app.js or whatever you want it to be. Then you install Express using the npm install Express command. This is the command I was saying we would see later that just installs Express for you. And that is what allows for us to have that Express module in our code base and able for us to then launch the server. Again, once you have all of those steps done, then all you got to do is very simply create a server for yourself in Express. That server, you just need to define a route, define the port, etc., and then make sure that your app is listening to that particular port. And then run the code. And you can run the code by just using node with the name of the particular file. So once you do that, again, then you're able to test the routes either in your browser, like it's saying here, or in an app like Postman on your own. So if you're able to do that on your side and you can see your application running on Postman or something like that, testing the server, just raise your hand just so I know that y'all are able to do that yourself. That'd be appreciated. And if not, go ahead and drop in the chat any questions as you try to launch your own server and test this route, hopefully in Postman, because it's just a better tool for testing the route. Cool. I see a couple people with their hands up. Thanks. That's dope to see. Again, yeah, I'll pause real quick. If you have a question or something, definitely pull up in the chat. If not, just take your time, just launch your server, pull it up in Postman, and make sure that you can at least test one of the routes that you've defined. I've been talking like a maniac, so I'm going to drink some water. Yeah, some folks are asking for the link to this. Yeah, no problem. All right, fam. So try to get something running on Postman, and then we'll keep pushing from there. That way, you have at least a running server up, so you can follow along with the next couple stuff that we'll do today. Thanks to the folks raising their hands. If you got it up, just raise your hand. Just that way, it helps me know who's got it, who don't got it, who need some help, etc. Cool. If you have any problems, or maybe it's just like, hey, I just need a little bit more time to launch the server, just let me know in the chat, or just put a thumbs up or something. That way I know. Otherwise, give it like a minute or two, and then we keep it pushing. Got it. Got it. I see. They're like, let me build my server. All right, go ahead. Great. Seeing a lot of folks got that going. Awesome. All right. So let's keep it pushing, and again, keep dropping any troubleshooting things in the chat. Hopefully all of us can help each other out if in case any of us are getting stuck on something. But if you can do all of those steps, congrats, fam. You just launched another server. You're lit. You know what I'm saying? You good. You good. You good money there. So creating a server is the first step, right? And the important aspect of building out your servers will come down to like, what do you want clients to be able to do, right? So there's a fair amount of architecting that happens when you're creating a server. And basically what you're going to be doing is creating a number of different types of routes, right? In your server, right? Again, just to kind of go over like the basics of the routing aspect of things, all routes follow a conventional structure. The structure is, hey, what is the method, the HTTP request method, the path that a client is going to be reaching out to, and the handler or the function that will be called when the client makes the request to that particular path. One thing that's important to note is that the method is what separates two different client routes. So what I mean by that is here you can see a good example of this, right? Here you see a GET request, a simple GET request. That GET request, and I think I can zoom in a little bit, right? That GET request is basically saying, hey, if the client performs a GET request to the root route, right? This is the function that we're going to send back to them, right? But we also see here now the introduction of a post request, a post request also to the root route. That's basically saying, hey, if the client makes a post request to this root route, we're going to send back this. So clearly we can have a route that has the same path, but it has different methods. And those different methods then separate the two types of routes. So let's take a look at what this means in practice, right? So first thing we're going to do is we're going to just copy over this post request to our server so we can have a post request as an example. So what I'm going to do is copy that from the Express template, and I'm going to go into my server. Again, I'm going to enter a couple times so that I can put it in here before my app.listen. Again, you want to put it before the app.listen because that's what basically the app's going to listen to the port with anything above it. So you don't want to put this stuff like underneath, because if it starts listening and it doesn't know that this exists, you're gonna get an issue, right? So before the app.listen, after some of these other routes, I'll just put this particular one, the app.post. And just for the sake of making it clear to see that they are very similar to this other one, I'm going to put it I'm going to put it up here a little bit closer to the GET request. So you can see, here's my GET request. Here's my post request, right? If I were to kind of block out the function, these look almost identical, right? The only difference is the GET versus the post, right? Well, let's save this route. So I'm going to save this route in here. And in order for my server to process that change, I'm going to stop the server running. So I did Control C in the terminal to stop the server again. And then I got to restart the server with the saved changes. So now the changes are there. So here now becomes a tricky, interesting question, right? I just told y'all the answer to this question, so hopefully y'all are paying attention. In the chat, I want you to type your answer to this. If I go to the browser right now and I go to localhost 3000, right? What kind of request is that going to perform for me? Drop it in the chat. And even if somebody else drops it in the chat, you drop it in the chat too, just so you always remember. If I were to go to my browser, like let's say I go over here to Brave again, and I say localhost 3000 and I press enter, right? What kind of request is this going to make for me? Go ahead, fam. Y'all got it. Y'all got it. Yeah, drop that in the chat. Yes, yes. Go ahead. Yep. 100%. There you go. Look at y'all. Yeah. A GET request. Never forget this, right? You can only use the browser to perform GET requests, right? If you have a different request, if I have a post request to this same route, I can't somehow tell the browser, hey, like make a post request. It can't. The browser by default makes GET requests. That is another reason why, in order to test APIs that make other requests, you can't just use the browser, right? So we can use Postman to resolve this problem, right? So what I'm going to do is go back to Postman, right? And here I am. Let me just close some of these. Close some of these tabs. I'll close them later. I'm sorry. It just making it little awkward here. Let's say don't save. Dang, let's just close them all, bro. Come on, don't do that to me. All right, cool. So if I go to localhost 3000, right? Here I have the option in Postman to define what type of request do I want to make on this arrow drop down here. So clearly I can make a GET request. I could just send the GET request and it will do the bring back the response. But I can also redefine this to say, hey, I want you to actually do a post request to that same route, right? And when I send this, you're going to see, oh, cool. The body down here in terms of the response shows, hey, got a post request, right? That's because if we looked at the code, how it was structured, right? The post request says, hey, if you go to app.post to the root route, you're going to get back some data that says got a post request. So we have this got a post request coming back through Postman. Go ahead and knock that out yourself. Copy over this post request, or structure your own post request and run it in Postman. And when you get back your response, just raise your hand so I know that you can see the post request come back in Postman. So for those of y'all who might be getting an error, right? Remember, if you change the post request, right? If you add the post request to your code, you have to save it and stop the server and restart the server before it can register that that new route is on there. So you might be getting an error because it's saying something like, hey, can't find this route or something, but that's because your server is still using the old routes. To fix that, all you got to do is in the terminal, stop the server. So you can do Control C to stop the server. And then to restart the server, you could do node with your server name in there to restart it. And then try the route again. Dope. All right, y'all. Just raise your hand. Make sure that you were able to run that post request. Because if so, I just want to kind of talk about some more aspects of the request that you might want to you're gonna want to be aware of. Dope, dope. Appreciate that. All right, cool. So clearly, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the post request route that I made. And then on the right-hand side, I kind of just dragged Postman so you can see what happens when I ran that on Postman. If I move this over a little bit more, just want to be able to see the, I got to just scroll. Yeah, whenever I send this request on Postman, I can get back the body and the results of the body. So cool. So this is kind of just like a typical setup when you start working with servers. What we're creating here are routes on a server for our applications to connect to. These particular routes allow for our application to connect to the server and basically request different type of information at different points. So if I wanted to create other routes, I could do that. But let's talk a little bit more about the differences between these two routes, and some of the stuff that we might see commonly used in the ways that these routes are structured. To do that, I'm going to go back to the Express documentation. I'm not sure, maybe they have some examples here. Oh, so they also have some examples here, like with put requests, delete requests, same concept, right? You just have the route. You can't call a put or a delete on the browser. You'd have to use something like Postman to try those routes out. Cool. So we're gonna take a quick second to look at. I want to talk through some of the API data that is here. I don't think we're actually on version 5. We're probably on version 4 because it's the last stable. So cool. So here in the API reference in Express, we're going to get some documentation that details out some of the core functions and properties in Express. So here's where you can learn more about, well, like that Express function, like what does it do, right? Oh, it creates an Express application, etc. So there's a couple different methods that you can see here on the left-hand side, but they're also kind of defined things for not only the Express function, but also you can see here application, request, response, and router. So if we were to go to application, this is where you see all of the like different properties and methods for the app that we create. So whenever I say app gets an Express, we create a new Express application. We use app.get, app.listen, etc. But here on the left-hand side, you can see some of the other methods that are defined there on in Express, right? So, just showing you this because you might start reading code online and you're like, well, what is this app dot blah, blah, blah that we haven't talked about? Well, here's where you can learn a little bit more about what those methods might be doing. The two objects that I wanted to touch on real quick are the request and the response objects down here, though. So I'm going to go ahead and click request. It says here, the request object represents the HTTP request and has properties for the request query string, parameters, body, HTTP headers, and so on. In the documentation, blah, 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 the object is always referred to as rec, and the HTTP response is res, but its actual name is determined by the parameters to the callback function in which you're working. So that's what I was saying earlier. Typically you see people call it rec and res, but if you rename these in your function, those will be the names that you have to use in order to work with that request. I want to address something that you see up here, though, right? The request object represents the HTTP request and has properties for the request query string, parameters, body, HTTP headers, and so on. All of these things are really important stuff that we really should know, at least you should know exist, because the way you write your server might use some of these particular properties when you're passing in information to the request. So let's talk about the first one, which is the query string, right? So the query string essentially is a property that you can pass into the request that has that basically contains a string for the for a query to a particular route. A good example of this is, let's see, what's a good example of this is if we go to Google real quick, right? and you go to Google and, you know, you type in something like Express API, right? At the top here, you can see the URL at Google kind of changed, and now it contains a lot of really interesting information in that URL. It has search, question mark, Q equals Express plus API, blah, 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 blah. Bunch of different draws in there, right? This big long URL has query text inside of it, right? This search Q equals Express plus API, blah, 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 right? This actually, the Q in this particular syntax refers to a query. I'm not suggesting that this is how your query strings will always look. This is particular to Google and its server, but I'm showing you this as an example of sometimes people will pass information into the request string, and that string of information you might want to process on your server, right? You could use things like the request query to parse through that string to get the information that you particularly need. So that's what the query string part of that is, right? Parameters are also similar, where a parameter basically is the ability for you to pass in information into the URL that you can parse as well. So parameters are basically named on a route. So if it says like here, for example, if you have a route /user/:name, then the name property is available as a parameter, rec.params.name. So if you wanted to get that parameter off of the request object, right, you could use the rec.params.name to get that information. So again, depending on how your route is structured, you might need to get different information off of the URL. And this is just an example of doing that for parameters inside of your URL. Thirdly, what else is here? The body, right? And this is a very important one because it's very commonly used when we're creating requests, is that we're going to use information stored on the request body. It says here, the request.body contains key value pairs of data submitted in the request body. By default, it's undefined and is populated when you use body parts of middleware such as express.json or express URL encoded. Basically, if we're going to be passing information through the body, which sometimes happens, especially with post requests, it's common that it's going to be common that that information will be stored in the request body. I'll show you an example of this in a second. If that's the case, right, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to get this information from the body of the request. To do that, we're going to need to use some other built-in Express functions to basically say, hey, Express, parse the body of these requests so that we can, make use of the information inside of it ourselves. So that's the body, and I'll show us a better example of this in a quick second. But let's talk about the last thing on here, which was HTTP headers. So when you are sending requests to a server, you have the option to create headers that you can pass into the request. Some of them are kind of predefined based on the type of request you're sending. But sometimes a request might ask you to define certain headers. I think you can see some of this in Postman, actually. If we go to Postman and at the top of our request, click headers here, it's going to show you some of the different types of headers that you'll see are common. Postman puts some in default for you, but these are the different types of headers that sometimes a server might require you to have certain headers to get some data. And so you can add those headers to your request and then send it off to get that information. So long story short, the request object can get very complex over time, right? In our case, we're using it very simply. In our case, we haven't been using it at all. right? Because these are very simple routes that aren't really kind of asking for any data of any kind, right? We haven't really made use of the request object. We've been just using the response object. And to quickly touch on that piece, the response object also has a number of different methods and properties on it that are just helpful to know that they exist. Things like the for the response, right? When you get back a response, you might want to, like we've been doing, send data, send a file, send a status. So those types of methods are very helpful. But also, what becomes very helpful as well is you can combine the response object with some of the request data that you have to send back some data to the server as well. So in this case, here they're creating a new GET request that is using params, right? And it's saying, hey, go to /user/ID and send back that user with that particular ID. So here's this is an example of, with the response, you might also send back data from the request or whatnot. Beyond that, right? Another a common set of methods used in responses would be things like, the response.json, which allows for you to send a JSON response over instead of just sending a piece of data or HTML or anything. You can send JSON and etc. So I'm showing you this not just to say, hey, these are the things you got to know immediately right now, but just to show you that there's a number of different methods on both the request and the response that you might need to use over time based on the characteristics of the server that you're going to be creating. For now, though, let's play around with some of the common ones on the request object that we just talked about, and see how we have to format those requests in order to make use of those particular other elements. So I kind of like that they gave us this nice little example for this user situation here. So I'm just gonna copy this one first. I'm gonna tweak it a little bit, and then I'll ask y'all to do the same. So in my server, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to create a new route. Underneath maybe like this test route that I have here, I'm just gonna create another route. It's gonna just be a GET route. I like to use user ID. That's cool. But instead of using the function keyword here, so this is cool to see that you could use the function keyword to make a function, but we like to do things modern, you know what I'm saying? So I'm just gonna quickly just turn this into an arrow function, like that. and yeah, this should be good. So let me save this first. In order to get this to work, I gotta stop the server and then restart it. Now that the server's restarted, I should be able to go to /user/ID. So let's say /user/ and I should get back some data. Cool. So that's working. So remember, if you're gonna have to go to /user/ some data to represent this parameter for ID. But go ahead and try it on your own. Just create this route for yourself and test it out. Putting some data in for the ID, and you can either test it on the browser because this is a GET request, or you could test it on Postman if you want. Just raise your hand when you got that param route in there working on your side. So remember, with this particular route, what we're looking at is us defining parameters. So we can define as many parameters as we want, into the route. But the cool thing about defining parameters is if a user passes this in, passes us in something with those parameters, we can parse it using the params section, the params function within the request. the params will let us say, hey, take the parameters from this route, and save it into this params object that we can use, which is real helpful and real cool. So in your case, if you're going to create a route like this, you're going to need to make sure you pass both that the original route path and then some data to represent the particular data here in the route path for those params. Dope. Cool. So I'm gonna keep it pushing. If you tried to do it and you didn't get a chance to do it, or you got stuck, definitely drop a note in the chat. But this is just a good example of like kind of using parameters, right? So with a parameter, you just kind of define it with the colon, and then you can parse it using the request object params to get back whatever it is the name that you gave that particular parameter. Just a really helpful part of using requests in parsing that query, or parsing this this path, I should say, this request. Another more commonly used piece of using data within the request is the body, right? So the body is always going to be an interesting part of your experience working with servers, because you'll see often that some applications will require data to be sent through the body, right? In this case, right, it's very simple to use the request body, but in order to do it effectively, what we have to do is we have to parse the information coming from the body. So to show you that, I'm going to go ahead, copy this function, this example route here that they have, and we're going to restart the server. I'm just going to go ahead and just clean this up just a little bit to just make it a little bit easier to see. So we have a post request here to /profile. And here we're going to make use of the body of information. But prior to doing this, right, what we're going to have to do is, so first I'll save this, right? I'm going to save this, make sure that this route is now being saved. So then I'm going to stop the server and rerun the server. So now that route is in use. Just doing this alone won't be enough for us to actually see this data, but let's take a look at it either way. I have a post request, right, going to /profile. The request, the response body is there. And here I'm saying, hey, console log the request.body. And then send a JSON with the request.body. So let's see what happens when I go to /profile in Postman, what comes back. So in Postman now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to localhost. I'm just going to add the /profile to it, make this post request real quick, press send, and I get this empty looking thing right here. It doesn't seem like there's anything here. And I also got a little console message that says undefined, right? But basically, right, the console log, this route got called, right? Clearly this route got called, but we're not seeing something in the console log, and we're not getting anything back for this JSON. There's a couple of reasons why, right? The first is, well, in order for us to console log the request.body, we need the request to have a body to console log. Right now, based on how we have called, based on how we called, let me just close this. Based on how we called our Postman, sorry about that. Based on how we called our Postman route here, right? We didn't actually define anything in the body. What's cool about Postman is based on those request object things we just talked about, you can see where you can use Postman to add all of those different things. So for instance, in Postman, if I want to add parameters to my query string, right, I can add them here. I can add them here in the param section of this this tab here. So if there was a parameter on, let's say we were going back to like the /user thing, right? And there was an ID, and I wanted to pass it as a query string, right? Here I could say user ID and then pass them like this. right? This kind of resembles the Google thing that I was talking about before, right? So here, if I was to say like, query equal, express da 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 da, express API. This is kind of like how the Google query string is set up, right? The difference is for Google is something like search, question, query equal, and then this kind of stuff, right? So this is how you could use Postman to create those parameters within your route if you had that. In my case, though, I'm using the profile post route that I just created, and I want to create a body in there. So I'm going to click body in here. And what you see here is there's a couple different options for how you can create a body in Postman. None basically makes it so that the request doesn't have a body, which is exactly why right now when I was running that particular code, I was getting undefined, right? There's no body for the console to see. There's a couple different options of how you can define the body in your request. You can pass form data and just kind of mark the type of form information here in the value. The URL form encoded is also is sent, like if you were to create an HTML form and you were to send the data from the form to your server, it'd be sent in this form URL encoded format. Raw allows you to then create either a text element of data, or if you click this little drop down, you can also create JavaScript, JSON, HTML, XML. Commonly used in the request and body situation is us using JSON to send the data as a data object in JSON. So in this case, if I want to send JSON data to my post route in the body, I'm going to have to go to body, raw, and then go to JSON to do this. By doing that, then I can define out some JSON that will be basically sent to the post request, sent through the post request as a part of the body. So in this case, right, I'm just going to create a super simple JSON. Remember, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's just a file formatting kind of syntax that allows for us to define key value pairs for that are going to be structured in a JavaScript object, like you see here. Remember, the package.json is a JSON file. So you can see this is an example of a JSON file. As a matter of fact, because this is an example of a JSON file, I'm just going to use this instead of copying one or building one from scratch. Basically, JSON structure is like key value pairs with all the keys and quotes, and all of the values have to be specific JavaScript elements. You can either use strings, you can use numbers, you can use Boolean values, but you can't pass things like functions, etc., because JSON as a file type doesn't actually use those. In this case, for this profile situation, I'm just going to say name. I'm going to use name and maybe ID as a example of the JSON here. I'm just going to say Cam. So I just made another little simple JSON, put this ID in there. And now I'm going to just do the post request with this. So the post request now is sending this data through the body to our server. Our server, whenever we send information to the server, right, is going to come back. Is going to come back into this route, and the route will be able to process it. One of the issues that we see here, though, is still we're in this undefined situation here with this console log for the request body. We're passing one now, but we're still getting undefined here. And that's because, like we saw in the Express documentation, in order for us to get the information back, it's defaulted to undefined, and it's only populated when we use body parsing middleware, such as express.json or express URL encoded. So this is meant to say, if I know I'm going to be getting data back in the body, I need to use some of this, what we call middleware, in order to process the data that's coming back from the body, right? So in this case, I'm going to be using JSON. But again, you might be using forms or other things that might be getting data there, right? So as you can see here, if I use either of these middleware functions in my application, it will help me parse this stuff out. I'll copy both of them just for the sake of doing it. But in my case, I'm not really using the URL encoded data right now. I'm just using JSON. So I could theoretically just copy the first one, but I'll copy both just because adding the middleware, adding the middleware doesn't necessarily hurt anything. Middleware essentially is a series of functions that exist to enhance how your application, your Express application works. So some middleware is kind of predefined, like the ones that we're just going to copy over here. But other middleware you might create yourself, and then you can have middleware to do things like ensure users logged in when they're going to a route. Basically, the middleware kind of is used in between the process of the app running and the app calling a route. So basically, you could think of it. That's why it's called middleware. It works within the middle of the those processes. So now that I added this, right, I'm gonna add that middleware. Then I'm gonna go ahead, stop the server again. So Control C and start it again because I just made that pretty big change. And now that that's there, go back to Postman. I see that my body is still defined, which is good. And now I'm gonna run it now and just ensure that now I'm getting back a response, which is great. The response is showing this JSON data, but that's because in my route, if we go down to the route for the profile, right? I said, hey, send back a JSON with the request.body. So essentially it's sending me back whatever is in the body. It's also supposed to console log it. And we can see now that we added that JSON parsing middleware. We're actually getting back this body of data as well. So I know there was a lot of little steps there. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to move this up so that y'all can see it a little closer. Go ahead and update your file in your server to use the express.json. You can add this other one for the URL encoded if you'd like. Make a route that is a post request and is going to be console logging or using the direct.body. And lastly, I know this is the third and kind of a lot of stuff. Create in your Postman a body, right, for that particular route. So all you got to do is go to the route, click body, go to raw and JSON and create the body for your JSON object there. And then when you run this, you should be able to get everything working, much like I did on my side. So let me just move this over some so y'all can see that. And just extend this a little bit. So 3 steps. Add your middleware into the app, add your post request, and then create a body for that particular post request in Postman, and you should be able to send this request in Postman and get everything coming back in the body and underneath. So go ahead, add those steps. If you have some trouble, please definitely reach out on the chat or just raise your hand if you get it working. Challenge yourself. Cool. If you're getting stuck on anything, please definitely reach out to me in the chat, or we're coming up on time, so you can stick around and just express any trouble you had. I just dropped the steps in there on the chat for you if you were getting stuck and you just wanted a quick refresher on what you got to do. Basically, whenever we're using a post request that's going to use a body and going to refer to the rec body, we need to make sure that we're passing some middleware in to parse the body from the request. To do that, there's a couple different ones that we can use. We can either use the express.json, which is good for parsing just app JSON data, or we can use the express URL encoded for parsing form URL encoded data. Once you've defined that middleware, and you have your route established, then in Postman, all you have to do is call a request to that particular route, which is this route here. But we have to create a body of data to use. To create the body, when you click this body tab, you'll see these options. You want to click this drop down on the right-hand side and change it from text to JSON, and then put in a JSON data inside of here that you can use. The JSON data is essentially just curly braces with key value pairs inside. The key value pairs are going to need to be wrapped with strings unless they're numbers or Boolean values, in which case you don't need to wrap them in a string. But cool, I'm gonna keep pushing. And y'all got the video so that y'all can look back at this a little bit later for sure. Cool, but thanks to the folks that raised their hand. I appreciate that. It's good to know that some folks were able to get it. Dope. Awesome. So this is a lot of like express routing kind of basics put into like, we just kind of jumped right in, right? The most important thing, as you can see, is creating routes is really going to be depending on the situation of how the data is going to be sent to your server, right? If the client's sending it through a GET request, right, then okay, I could just send some data back. If the client's sending post requests, post requests, what make them tricky is that they can't be executed through the browser window itself. So in order to use post requests, not only will you have to test them on Postman, but clients have to make very specific basically have to make very specific requests in their code to get a post request data back. We also talked a lot about the different types of ways we can work with the request body and the request data. So you can use things like params, right, to define specific params in your requests and get that data that way. You could use query strings like you just saw that I did in Postman. But you also can just use the request body, which is a very popular and common way for us to work with our post requests, is that we'll create post requests and send data in the body, but then the server will the server should be able to use the body to then, process whatever it needs to process. The last thing I want to touch on related to kind of Express server side stuff is the hosting of files. Right? Because files are very important, because it's not just the case that we're going to just be sending back code all the time from our server. Sometimes we want to send back files and information. In the Express Getting Started guide, it also talks a little bit about how we do this, right? So it says this: to serve static files such as images, CSS files, and JavaScript files, use the express.static built-in middleware function in Express. We just kind of talked about what a middleware function is. Essentially, it's just a function that works to perform some actions prior to our routes being called. Basically, if you want to host files on a server, right, the way you do that is you make that file a static file, first of all. So you make whatever argument, whatever directory has the file, or whatever the path is for the file, a static route in your Express server. Then you're able to then essentially host any of the information inside of that particular folder or file as a asset in your Express server. So in this example, they're going to turn an entire folder into a static asset, which means that now anything within that folder will be able to be referenced from your server as just a particular URL. So in this case, they had a folder called public, and in that public folder, they had an images folder, a CSS folder, JavaScript folder, and maybe some HTML. And that way, by hosting that particular folder, they're able to then make reference to all of these particular assets inside of their in the Express. You can do that for multiple folders, etc. It just is all about first making them static so that they can be used in order to make that asset a resource. Anything else on this piece? Sometimes if you, so basically what's important to note is that when you use the static, the express.static, blah, 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 it is going to run relative to the directory from where you launch your node process. So basically we call node index.js, right, inside of the folder from inside of our Express folder. But it's saying, hey, if you ran Express from a different directory, it's safer to use the absolute path of the directory that you want to serve. So sometimes you'll see, instead of folks just saying Express static with just the name of the folder, you'll see people call it Express static with this kind of funky looking path syntax that just basically says, use the current directory that I'm in and then the public folder. So you'll see kind of examples of both as you start hosting files. But what's cool about this, right, and the reason I'm showing you this is because this creates the basis for us hosting files on a server, right? How many of y'all, just show a thumbs, right, have always wanted to host your own sites on your own, you know, host your own websites and do everything yourself, right? We've seen some couple examples of how we can host our websites and stuff using some third-party software, etc. But you know, it's always cool to know how those things work behind the scenes. And behind the scenes, what's going on is we're creating a server and we're creating an ability for us to host our files on that server. This method of creating static files is how we do that, specifically here in Express, right? So to show you this a little bit, what I want to do is real quickly with the time that I have, I want to turn a file, a folder into something static that I can then host, right? So what I want to do is this. I'm going to, let's see, what's the best way for me to do this? So we have this server running right now that we've been working on, right? This is just the server side code that I've been working with in general. So what I want is a folder essentially that is going to have some code that will represent maybe like my client side, or just a set of code that will represent basically the, you know, the how do I describe this? The files that I want us to host on the server. So let's say, for instance, I want to host like a little client in there. Maybe inside of that client side folder, I'll have like a very simple index.html file, and that index.html file will just have some basic HTML in there, right? Oh, my bad. I'm tweaking. I'm like, why is this not working? It's been so long. I've written HTML. I'm like, dang, getting rusty. Getting rusty over here. And then just the super simple HTML drawn in here. So this is just a basic HTML file. I'm sure everybody kind of is good on that. But the idea is inside of my server, right? I can host the files inside of this as a static file, right? So to do this, I can use either the particular path to the I can use this either as the particular path to the folder. So in my case, I could call this public. That's fine too. Or whoops, before new folder, let me just rename this to public. Right. So I have this folder now. It's called public. Right. If I use this express static public, what that's going to allow me to do is leverage any of the files inside of there as static files, which means I can then refer to those files from my server. So let me just show you this real quick, fam. So I'll just Control C, and I'm going to go ahead, rerun the server. And now I should be able to go to this particular file for, I can go to those particular files. So let's go to localhost 3000 slash, I don't remember what I named this, John, index.html. So in here, whoops, logos 3000 slash index.html, and boom, here's my HTML file being served up from my server side, right? That's cool, and it's essentially how our local development server's been working. Every time we've been saying, hey, you know, run the local server, the live server on VS Code, right? Like we were basically doing this, creating a server that then allowed for us to see our file here. And what was cool about it was eventually, as we were making changes, it was live reloading. Our server isn't able to live reload yet, but those are things we can fix. Essentially, what I want you to know is that we can create the public directory is very specific in servers, where if you create a public directory, anything in the public directory will be able to be accessed like this, like just accessed. If I want to create a set of paths to particular things outside of the public directory, that's when like you saw before, I can make another directory that's not necessarily my public directory static as well, and use that in order to use that inside of my routes specifically. So I'll send, and then the next time we link up, we're going to continue to talk about this, because now that we know, oh, cool, like I can like send data and create HTML files and save these things. The logical next question is, well, how can I do this with React and have my React applications hosted on my server? So that's what we'll be working on next. Thank you for your time and your attention today. I'll send some more information on that in our Slack. But I hope that you all learned a lot today. If you did, send me some love before you go. If you have a question, feel free to stick around.